Good evening and welcome. My name is Patrick Müller and I'm Professor for European Studies here at the Diplomatic Academy, and I would like to welcome you all here at the Diplomatic Academy for this evening's lecture on big data and intelligence in the early Cold War by Professor Nick Cullather. Professor Cullather earned his PhD at the University of Virginia, and he is a professor of history and of international studies at Indiana University. He's also the editor of the Journal of Diplomatic History. His research focuses on issues such as intelligence, development, and nation building. And among his books is The Hungry World, America's Cold War Battle Against Poverty in Asia, which was awarded several important prizes, including as the best book on US foreign relations. Professor Cullather is also serves as Fulbright visiting professor here at the Diplomatic Academy. So Professor Cullather, again, on behalf of the whole Diplomatic Academy, we would like to welcome you very warmly here with us in Vienna. And I would also like to use the occasion to, of course, express our gratitude to the Fulbright program, which actually is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. So also at this point, thank you very much for this excellent cooperation over many years by now. But now I would like to give the floor, or probably I should say the digital room, to Professor Cullather, and we're all excited to hear about big data and intelligence in the Cold War.
Thank you, Professor Müller. I really appreciate that kind introduction. And I also want to thank Ambassador Brix and Professor Kornprobst and the staff and the students of the Diplomatic Academy for the wonderful welcome that you've given to Melanie and me over the past few weeks. It's been wonderful to be here. And I'd also like to thank the Austrian American Educational Commission for sponsoring my Fulbright grant to be here. Let me begin with a story. In 1947, the House Appropriations Committee invited Allen Dulles to paint a picture of the new Central Intelligence Agency. This was just a couple of weeks after Congress had created the CIA. Dulles was one of America's most legendary spies from World War II. There's an assumption, I think, in a lot of the literature on the history of intelligence in the United States, that the powerful bureaucracy that the intelligence community is now was what was intended from the beginning. And in that perspective, Dulles's answers to the committee's questions were really interesting. They wanted to know things like, what was the size of the staff going to be? Where were they going to be based? What were they going to spend money on? Dulles replied that in terms of staff, they should think of about 200 people. And then things got really interesting. Where would they be based? He said, not overseas. They would mostly be based in New York and San Francisco, where they could monitor and debrief returning businessmen and journalists and professors who would bring back information from overseas. They were not going to be spies in the ordinary sense. They would be analysts, a small elite cadre of professionals using the latest technology to marshal vast quantities of information and neatly separating speculation from fact. Behind these ideas, behind this vision, was an idea of a dawning age of information. It was an attitude, not unlike the aspirations and fears that one hears today about information technology, with a key difference. Today, we worry about a crisis of expertise. We worry about the post-fact society. and the growing menace of misinformation and alternative realities. David Kennedy and others have argued that the post-war international system may have been built on informational routines that are now swept away by the demise of a particular type of print journalism. In the 1930s and 1940s, by contrast, there was a sense that a fact-based society was in the making, that human relations were about to be put on a scientific footing, that political science, for instance, might actually become like physics, a hard statistical predictive science that would reveal the hidden realities of the human molecule. And there was an urgency to complete this job. And that view was widely shared. Within intelligence circles, the idea was generally called central intelligence. And it was what put the central in the CIA. But it had equivalents in journalism, where it manifested itself in the popularity of documentary film and newsreels and digest magazines and almanacs that promised to bring all of the necessary facts into a single place and make them easily digestible. In academic circles, it was generally called the unification of knowledge, or the unity of science. And it spawned massive projects of fact gathering, one of which is my subject today. The Human Relations Area Files was an early Cold War attempt to create an ethnographic catalog of the human race. This is a picture of it right here. The aim was to condense the entire literature on the world's 2,000, and sometimes they would say 3,000 people, into a single file. It was hard for people at the time to understand fully what it was. There was no vocabulary to describe it. Today, it would be known as a query searchable networked relational database. The term database, however, didn't come into circulation until 1956, when the project was already 7 years old. It operated simultaneously at 16 different universities and a half a dozen known and unknown government agencies, but it was generally known as a consortium, not a network. Observers particularly struggled with the idea that it was both an index and the library itself, a term that we now refer to as full text, but there was no word for that at the time. Why is this interesting? Well, for a number of reasons. First, it was the largest and most expensive social scientific project of the 1950s. It was funded initially by the Carnegie Corporation, and then by the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Central Intelligence Agency, and CIA Front Foundations, and later by international corporations, Kodak and Daewoo. If you were a grad student working at a elite American university in the 1950s, chances are you worked for the Human Relations Area Files at one time or another. And that included a number of figures who would later be prominent in theoretical and academic disciplines. People, our students may know, Benedict Anderson, the specialist on nationalism, Andre Gunder Frank, the originator of dependency theory in development, Francis Fox Piven, the guru for Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, and a person whose picture is in the lobby of the Diplomatic Academy, Henry Kissinger. And we'll talk more about him later. Secondly, it was the most advanced information system of its time. The Central Intelligence Agency at one point worried that the Human Relations Area Files would take over some of its functions. It's been described recently as a proto-World Wide Web, but it was resolutely analog. It's a reminder that the dream of total information was an instantaneous retrieval preceded computerization and was invested in technologies such as microfilm, offset printing, dry photography, decimal indexing, and punch coding. We often forget that early digital computer development happened alongside major advances in analog information technologies. It's a reminder also that the fact-based world order was an act of deliberate and painstaking effort. Huge international investments were made in establishing bodies of fact and presenting them to the public. Such efforts included the International Map of the World, which mapped the entire landmass of the planet at a common scale, 1 to 1 millionth, and with a common legend. The UNESCO Collection of Representative Works, an effort that took 56 years to publish in translation all of the major works of literature of each country in the world. The World Weather Watch, still in operation today, a global system of weather observation. And of course, the CIA World Fact Book. These tended to share a number of characteristics. They were all colossal in both ambition and cost, but mainly they were different in that they attempted to be the final word on the subjects that they covered. We often hear researchers today talk about their objective in terms of raising questions or of adding complexity to a subject. This was not the style of the early 1950s. Instead, they aimed to be complete, to be final, to have total information on the subject, and to be the last word. It's a reminder, finally, of the delusions and dangers in such efforts. Driven by the fantasy of total information and by, at times, international competition for the command of facts, academics pushed to create systems over which eventually they had very little control. As with Facebook, unbounded information was initially touted as an innocent channel for human connection, but ultimately growth became the goal, and the files were available for nefarious and other unexpected uses. The files began here at the Yale Institute for Human Relations, which, along with other institutes at Princeton, Columbia, Harvard, and Michigan, embarked in 1929 on a project to create a unified and controlling social science as an aid to government planning. So it started with this gentleman here, George P. Murdoch. Here he is talking with the director of the Institute, Mark May. George Murdoch is probably most famous as the inventor and popularizer of the concept, the nuclear family, which he did in the 1930s. So the nuclear family actually preceded the nuclear bomb. He was known as somewhat backward in his scholarship. He was a follower of Spencer, Sumner, and the doctrine known as social Darwinism. And it pitted him against Edward Sapir, a Boasian anthropologist, student of the famed anthropologist Franz Boas, classmate and sometime lover of Margaret Mead. It's said that Margaret Mead left for Samoa after their breakup, who is an advocate of cultural relativism as a theory and thick description as an anthropological technique. When the Institute was created, part of the purpose that Yale had in doing it was to sweep dinosaurs like Murdoch out of there. He was pushed out of the anthropology department and demoted to sociology, which was considered a major demotion at the time. Sapir was made chair of a new anthropology department, and Murdoch began plotting his comeback. He needed a scientific method to prove the existence of norms that operated across cultures and were ranked in a temporal hierarchy whereby societies would move through stages of social development. And so he hit upon the idea of a file of ethnography consisting of duplicated excerpts, along with a comprehensive decimal index, parsing every aspect of human life, religion, diet, child rearing, commerce, politics, everything. The decimal format, in fact, made it infinitely expansible, as well as infinitely granular. And comparison was implicit in the model. And this put it at odds with Boasian anthropology, which rejected categorization and hierarchy, as well as evolutionary theories of development, in favor of understanding cultures on their own terms. To donors, though, and this is where Murdoch had the advantage, he understood what Sapir did not, which was that the final decision would be made by the funders. To the donors, thick description and cultural relativism was just vague. They preferred the concreteness of Murdoch's file design. In the 1930s, the Institute for Human Relations began putting substantial Rockefeller money toward this because they could imagine its uses for their own purposes, but they could also see uses for economists, political scientists, behavioralists, all kinds of disciplines, as well as for government uses. From the beginning, it was an interdisciplinary tool that was not highly regarded within its home discipline. The flexibility of this made it tremendously useful in World War II. There was concern that was aroused in 1941 in American magazines, a tremendous scare about a man called Karl Haushofer and his comprehensive files at the Institute for Geopolitik in Munich. Allegedly, according to American magazines, and this is in the months immediately prior to Pearl Harbor, some 1,000 scientists were assembling files called the Strategic Index, a set of dossiers on every country in the world looking for points of weakness, fifth columns, deficiencies, resources, you name it. The United States decided it needed its own strategic index, and there was a bit of a files race. So Murdoch's files came to be put at the disposal of Nelson Rockefeller's Office of Inter-American Affairs, and then later in the war, the US Navy, which integrated classified information from the Pacific, particularly Micronesia, but also Asia, Japan, and the rest of Asia. So these were essentially two projects, both of which were managed by Murdoch during the war. At one point, he became a Navy officer at the rank of lieutenant commander, and several of his graduate students were also put into uniform so that they could read the classified data in the files. By the end of the war, Yale now had a massive file with all of this information taken in from Latin America and the Pacific and Asia. The Carnegie Corporation and the Social Science Research Council in the United States were, at that point, trying to generate interest in the area studies at American universities, with world regions being parceled out to particular universities to specialize in. They were looking for a project to collect all of the scholarship they were generating and to unify these scholars in a common project. And this was the origins of the Human Relations Area Files Incorporated, which initially was a consortium of 10 universities. Yale oversold the project to the donors and to the universities. They claimed it would be comprehensive, that it would cover all peoples of the world, and that it would be standalone, containing both the index and the materials themselves, filed and punch-coded according to the indexing scheme that Murdoch had developed. Other universities would contribute to the files, and each of the contributors would have an identical copy. It did generate a considerable amount of cross-cultural research at the beginning, but its findings were not always welcome. One of its first findings was that premarital sex was normal in cultures around the world. An American audience that was still quite prudish and primed by the Kinsey report to be outraged was particularly galled by the implication that American values and morals ought to be set by some kind of a statistical tabulation coming out of a file. The files were duplicated at that point by Ditto machine, which was capable of making 200 copies at a time. That was a major advance technologically at the time, but even with a staff of 20, human relations area files could not produce fast enough. The director, Cleland Ford, at that time began asking around Washington to try to find a government sponsor. And he was largely stonewalled until June of 1950, when the beginning of the Korean War opened the floodgates of security spending. The Navy, the Air Force, the CIA, and later the Army granted over $3 million a year to the human relations area files. Production in New Haven went into high gear, and Ford experimented with the latest photo duplication and miniaturization technologies. He used microcard, a predecessor to microfilm, microfiche, one of the first major academic projects to use that technology, and new duplicating technology developed by the Haloid Xerox Corporation. And we can see here some examples of these machines at work. These were the very first model of the Xerox machine. In the 1960s, the Xerox 912 would automate the 12 steps of this process. But in 1951, they were done manually, using what looked like a large format camera, the Xerox number 4, that's this device right here. A book page was photographed onto a selenium plate, which was a reusable metal foil framed with wood. The plate was inserted into a rocker, and the powdered ink, which we now know as toner, was spooned onto it from a jar. And then after it was gently rocked back and forth to cover it with toner, the toner would adhere to an electrostatic image that had been placed on there by the camera. And then a sheet of treated paper called the multi-lith master was clamped onto the frame using both hands and the chin. So you can imagine this: clamp, 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 to put that on there. The toner would then adhere to the multi-lith master, revealing the image. You could then feed you then had to feed the multi-lith master into a toaster oven known as the fuser. That's this device right here. The ink is then heated and fused onto the master. After that, the master was put onto a duplicating machine, and you could run off 2,000 copies. And after you were done with that, the selenium plate would be cleaned by running it under a reversed polarity corona wire, and then you were ready for page 2. Within 3 years, the project began to veer from its original mission. Human relations area files, under Army contract, was asked to supply a series of country counterinsurgency handbooks. This was the biggest single project that they undertook in terms of money and in terms of personnel. It was contracted out to University of California at Berkeley, Cornell, Chicago, Indiana University, Harvard, and Columbia. At Harvard, Henry Kissinger managed the staff of 21 consultants and researchers on a single subcontract, the handbook on East Germany. Another contract at Indiana University involved not just producing the handbook, but also a military exercise in which an entire company of US Army troops was welcomed to campus and given lectures during the day, and then live fire exercises at night, all of this to simulate an American occupation of Finland. Federal funding, however, proved fragile. And under Eisenhower, social scientific projects were cut. But this didn't decrease the military's need for this kind of information. And so the Army insourced the project, making its own contracts now directly with academics and cutting HRAF out. So HRAF was essentially the middleman being cut out of the New Deal. The discovery in 1956 of the Soviet All-Union Institute of Scientific and Technical Information, which some American scientists visited, thrust the word database into the public consciousness. All of a sudden, the United States realized that it was in a database race, along with the space race, the arms race, and the development race. And government investment in data centers at Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, and other universities began to expand. From this point forward, a majority of HRAF's funding now came from the National Science Foundation and from corporations interested in developing new database technologies. They had contracts, for instance, with the Eastman Kodak Company, which was developing a Boolean searchable microfilm reader, which you could tap certain keywords into, and it would automatically dial the microfilm to the right frame for you to read. The files at this point were seen as a model and a testing ground for the digitization of data, for search algorithms, and for networking. HRAF continued to seek and receive intelligence and Pentagon funding throughout the 1960s, but a real change had occurred. The content of the files became less important than the technology of retrieval, and it became an innovator in that area. Politically speaking, HRAF got out of the business of providing ethnographic information to the military at just the right time. In the 1960s, there was a new sensitivity around academics being used for intelligence purposes. The Army's successor agency, known as SORO, touched off a firestorm with Operation Camelot, which was exposed in 1966, when an academic subcontractor of the Army called his colleagues in Latin America to let them know that he was gathering information for the US Army and could they supply him with certain books and materials. Camelot and another scandal, known as the Thailand affair in 1970, led to a real soul-searching reconsideration of academic ties to counterinsurgency, to the Vietnam War, but also to the filing systems that connected academia to the security services in the United States and allowed unintended uses of research. An ad hoc investigation committee chaired by Margaret Mead found, quote, "It is clear that anthropologists now have to face the possibility that the publication of a routine sociocultural data about identified village communities or the assemblage of unpublished data in centralized files might be used for the annihilation by bombing or other forms of warfare of whole communities. And such data lend themselves to computerization and mass depersonalization of communities marked for destruction." The irony is that HRAF was not computerized. A Swedish computer firm called Wenner-Gren funded a conference on it here in Vienna in 1962. But HRAF personnel were resolutely committed to the analog version of the files. And other anthropologists argued that both the selection and classification of the contents of the files was suspect, so that a machine for generating statistical correlations among them would be, in Berlin anthropologist Wilhelm Milke's phrase, and Patrick, you may have to help me with the pronunciation here, a Zahlenfriedhof, a graveyard of numbers. How'd I do?
Excellent, excellent.
Is a common problem of bad data in, bad data out. Machinery and technological advances only helps you make bad decisions faster. A decade after the anthropologists realized that a database could easily be turned for nefarious purposes, it was the government's turn. In 1987, the National Security Council warned that privately owned network databases were being used by adversaries for intelligence gathering. They were particularly worried about the combination of private, commercially available databases like LexisNexis, a newspaper database. If you were to combine that with other databases that provided government reports and legal transcripts, and combine that with a bibliographic and reference database, and then combine that with a database, say chemical abstracts, that provided you with technical information on a particular thing, you could produce very unexpected results that would be very interesting to foreign intelligence services. Reagan's national security aide, John Poindexter, drafted guidelines requiring data firms to give the CIA and FBI information on users, to restrict sensitive contents, and to limit subscribers to US nationals, setting off the predictable outcry from scientists and universities about personal freedom and academic liberties. Only the end of the Cold War, which happened a couple of years later, headed off a real clampdown on the contents of databases. Apprehensions about HRAF and about other databases are mirrored in concerns expressed more recently about artificial intelligence by Henry Kissinger in an article ominously titled, "How the Enlightenment Ends." Kissinger said that there are three major dangers with artificial intelligence. Firstly, it may achieve unintended results due to misinterpretation and lack of context. Secondly, it may change human thought processes and values. And thirdly, the rationale for conclusions is unknown, based on opaque algorithms and correlations. I want to point out that all three of these concerns were voiced from the beginning, as far back as Edward Sapir, about the human relations area files. That's not to say they're unfounded, because all three proved to be valid later on. It is to say, however, that by the time the early warnings came true, the technology was well on its way to being eclipsed by newer, even more terrifying technologies. By the time HRAF's flaws were fully aired, we were more worried about computerized databases. Private computer databases provoked an alarm just 2 years before Sir Timothy Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. So the historical pattern, if there is one, is that Kissinger's dark prophecy will come true, but that by the time it does, we'll have bigger things to worry about.
Professor? Professor, just a question. Actually, that prophecy of Kissinger kind of reminded me of what Elon Musk is currently saying as well about AI.
I don't know what he's saying about AI.
Well, he's basically also saying the same thing, that the same problems and that AI is one day, well, he's pessimistic. He's saying that AI is going to take over basically humanity, and that it's going to be much smarter than man.
And this, of course, was a worry about these kind of files as they were created at the time, that they had a essential nefarious, sinister nature to them, that they were autonomous, and that one didn't know what kind of results would come out of it.
Yes.
So there's a similar pattern here.
Maybe let me quickly come in and say that we will also have a question and answer session after this. And I can see it's really a fascinating talk. So it already triggers all kinds of questions. I can also see it via Facebook. But let's give Professor Cullather a chance now to finish the talk, and then we will have a question and answer session.
Yes, sir. Yes.
In 1953, when the director of HRAF was asked about it, Cleland Ford replied that its purpose was to create a sound understanding of the world's peoples, which in turn would lead to international peace. HRAF still exists, and there's evidence that as recently as 2014, it was still being used for counterinsurgency training and planning. It's now a computer subscription service, and grad students still base their dissertations on it, although very few anthropology students do. There are believed to be 2 copies of the files still in existence. One is in New Haven at Yale in the HRAF offices, and the other is at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, the former office of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who kept a copy himself and used it frequently in his own research. That's all I have for now, so I am open for questions.
Thank you so much. I guess, listening to an historic account of big data and databases and digitalization makes us feel a little bit older, no? When we walk home today, that, things that sound fairly recent, studied by historians, but it was really exciting also to see, how these processes connected all kinds of scientists, including social scientists, including people portrayed at our lobby. I would also like to welcome Ambassador Briggs. I have seen that in the people joining the meeting, he is also part of it. So also very warm welcome to our director and all the people joining us from outside via Facebook. Please, if you have questions, you can copy them in the Facebook in the Facebook comments, and I will receive them. And then, of course, we have quite a few students with us, so I'm sure that that there are many questions, and I would open the floor to the questions. Yes, Ms. Parsche.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I have quite a specific question to you. I once heard that data back in the 60s basically helped John F. Kennedy to actually win the elections. My question to you would be, do you agree that nowadays this is kind of the other way around, that too much data, especially social media and the whole development of fake news is rather not helping to win elections, but is rather creating too much information, which is then influencing people in the wrong way? I would be interested in your opinion on that. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very interesting question, Caroline. Jill Lepore has recently written a book about the analytics firm run by Ithiel de Solapool that helped John F. Kennedy win the 1960 election. And the interesting thing is that there too, a lot of the concerns that we now voice about Facebook were first aired. It was considered to be tremendously unfair. The Kennedy family kept the secret of their use of this firm as tightly held as possible, but they weren't able to keep it from coming out entirely. And so when it did, it raised real questions about whether they had won the election fairly or whether there had been some kind of a rigging going on because they had used it. And Kennedy replied at a press conference that they hadn't relied on it for anything, that they didn't trust the computers to give them information, but in fact they did. They had adjusted Kennedy's message on a number of different things, including some key ones, particularly his positions on race relations, in line with the recommendations of the analysts. So yes, this is a pattern that we've seen before. Another interesting pattern is the second part of your question. Your second part of your question raises is this question about too much information. And I have to say that in history is a recurring phenomenon. And in fact, there was a tremendous sense in the 17th century that there was too much information. That was the point at which it became easily visible that there were more books than a human being could read in a lifetime. And so the question became, how do you manage that information? And the answer was the development of the category of books that we now call reference books. So dictionaries, encyclopedia, and things like that were meant to condense this wilderness of information into something that a human being could manage. And that same fear very much gripped people in the 1930s. There was seen as this flood of new information coming in via radio, a film, telegraph, and a telephone that a single person couldn't manage all of this information. And so one of the things I'm researching is the way in which these new systems, including the system called the Central Intelligence Agency, were really created to manage this unmanageable flow of information. So there was, at that time, and this may be a difference with the present that we can point to, there was a kind of a can-do attitude that, yes, there is a major problem with this flood of information, which needs to be verified, which needs to be managed in some way so that the public isn't deceived. But also a similar sense that we could do this, that the government could make investments in particular areas that could fix this problem.
There's a question from Veronica, and I think I group questions. So Veronica and then Katharina, please.
Yes, thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. And I would like to ask a question about the present. So my question would be whether it is more difficult for democratic countries to use big data for intelligence purposes. And if yes, how could the democratic countries create an intelligence system which has the same efficiency as countries like non-democratic systems? Thank you.
Well, I have to warn you that I'm a historian. And what I do is I study things 50 to 75 to 100 years after they happen. So all of that is just to say that I'm happy to answer that question. Get back to me in 75 years. And, I'll be happy to tell you how that comes out. What I can tell you is that those same concerns were raised early on and in connection with the Murdoch's files and the Human Relations Area files. The panic that Americans felt when they believed, falsely, that the Nazis had developed a sophisticated, all-encompassing filing system of big data that they could use to defeat the Allies. It was a tremendous fear, and it was an idea that this is something that the Nazis could do really well. One only needs to think about the tremendous, sinister power that the word dossier had back in the 1940s. If you've seen the movie Casablanca, Major Strasser says, Mr. Rick, I have read your dossier. The Nazis were seen as having this tremendous filing capability that gave them an edge over the weaker democratic countries. So the kind of apprehensions that you're talking about are common in the past as they are in the present. And in the past, at least, the democracies rose to the challenge by developing filing systems of their own in response. Also in the past, the fear that they had was overblown. It turned out that House Hoffer did not have a strategic index. There was no strategic index, no 1,000 scientists, no Institute for Geopolitics. All of it was simply imagined by the press at the time, which believed that the Nazis had gained a significant new asset in their war.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm more helpful on that question.
Thank you so much for your very interesting lecture. I actually have two questions. Today, many experts suggest that we are in a new type of Cold War, and big data is increasing the power competition between US and China. And I wanted to ask you if you maybe see similar patterns of Cold War, or is it totally different today? And my second question would be, in your opinion, how important was the role of individual agency in the analysis of big data during the Cold War? Because human beings were once responsible for analyzing these huge lumps of data, and one has to have a certain knowledge or to hear this noise, that something disturbing this noise of information, or make a choice to how to analyze it. So was human mistake possible with so highly developed machines? Thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the things that's a recurring phenomenon is the fear that is first of all the fantasy that we can control a technology, that the owners of a technology at one time will always possess an advantage in it. And so a few years ago, you definitely had a sense in the United States that big data was something that the United States had an edge in, and that it was not going to lose that advantage, that it was going to hold on to that, and that was going to be a permanent feature of the American security system around the world. And subsequently, of course, it's proven to be now seen as a major weakness. So we have this vacillation between seeing something as an unchallengeable strength and then disappearing into a notion that anybody can do this. The question of individual human agency is behind a lot of the concerns about this thing. It's actually the reason why people at Human Relations Area Files were insistent on not computerizing, because they believe that the human act of rummaging through the files contextualize them in a much better way than any machine-driven software would. And then in fact, machine-driven algorithms would be dangerous in the sense that they would be unchecked. No one would go back and kind of look at the data that it collected and the reasons for why those particular pieces of fact were brought together into the same category. And so there was, at that time, a tremendous concern, at least within the organization, about not using the database in this way. But then again, they were eclipsed. Because they didn't adopt the newest technology, others did. And databases kind of moved on from them. And then in the end, they were simply kind of pushed out of the field.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Milan. Milan, please.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we hear you very well.
So, Professor, you briefly mentioned Operation Condor. And my question to that would be if you could just briefly for everyone explain shortly what it was and how big data collection was used in it specifically.
Sorry, I probably wasn't pronouncing well. Not Operation Condor, Operation Camelot.
Oh, Camelot. Oh, excuse me. That's my mistake.
Yes,
That's my...
Operation Condor was an operation of 3 different Latin American governments who cooperated with one another against communism, against dissidents who they saw as communists within their midst, and which is associated with disappearances in Argentina and with many, many nefarious crimes. Operation Camelot was the Army's attempt to take over what Human Relations Area Files did and to do it in-house. And so what they did was they directly contracted with academics around the world to gather the kinds of information that they needed about counterinsurgency. And it came to be exposed in 1966 in an interesting way. It wasn't exposed by the press, and it wasn't exposed by academics policing their own. Instead, it was a diplomat who, at the embassy in Chile, was suddenly facing questions from the local press about why American academics were calling their counterparts in Chilean universities and asking for various types of data. And it turned out it was part of this thing called Operation Camelot. It created a huge press firestorm throughout Latin America, that all of a sudden now American academics were suspect because they were there to spy on the countries that were their host countries. And Congress actually passed legislation barring the Pentagon from doing this kind of research.
Thank you for your answer, and this is very interesting, and thank you.
We have two more questions, one from Mogis Teshome and then Leila, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Müller and Professor Cullather for this presentation. I have just one question, and it's actually related to the first question which was raised by Caroline, and which is actually, it is not for me about the amount of data, but does truth and the fact really matter? Because it seems that, especially, particularly in the US politics, that we live in the post-factual era. So does truth and the fact really matter, especially in the contemporary US politics? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think there's tremendous concern that it doesn't anymore. I think you can draw a distinction between the Cold War era and the present, even though in the Cold War era, there was tremendous effort put on both sides into propaganda. But propaganda is somewhat different from the kind of misinformation that we see circulating now. Propaganda, in many ways, is a kind of homage to the importance of factuality. It's an attempt to distort the facts and to insert one's own point of view into those facts. But what it does is it confirms that command of reality is the most important thing, the most important determinant of one's national success and of the validity of one's ideology. So in a way, both sides in the Cold War were very invested in being in command of their facts. And now one sees a rather novel attitude that the idea of propaganda is not to distort one's view, but to simply sow confusion and to make people mistrust anything that they learn. And consequently, you then create a world in which many other things are possible. Policy choices can't be debated rationally, and policy pronouncements can't be understood in their true meaning in this kind of blizzard of disinformation. And so there's a real concern that the age of fact has passed away. And one of the messages I want to give is that if we look back at the past, one of the things that they knew that we have forgotten is that to create a world of facts, you actually have to invest in facts. You actually have to create institutions whose job it is to work out commonly agreed upon factual basis for international politics, statistical bodies, standard measurements, and authoritative voices that are capable of issuing reports that are believed. And those are the kind of investments that we were willing to make in the 1940s and that we seem less willing to make now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Leila, it would be you.
Good evening, and first of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation. So I have recently read an article which is on the British signal intelligence. And what I found really interesting was that in practice, the signal intelligence did not lose relevance for British policymaking with the end of the Second World War. But yet British signal intelligence is almost entirely absent from entirely Cold War historiography. So I would like to know what is the main reason behind it, and because I also saw the classified reports that came out in the first decade of the 21st century. So did actually Britain profit from the collection of the intelligence on Eastern Europe, and to what extent? Thank you.
I wouldn't say that it's completely absent, but it is understated. to a large extent, and a lot of this has to do with secrecy. The signals intelligence is the most carefully guarded secrets that governments have. And consequently, they're very reluctant to share that information or to declassify that information and allow historians to see it. And so consequently, historians really have no clue how much different intercepts and signals intelligence breakthroughs affected different aspects of policy. There are moments, if one looks at the historiography of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, there's quite a bit in there about what we knew using signal intelligence about what the Soviets were thinking and doing, what the Americans knew. But by and large, secrecy prevails, and it's going to be a long time before the United States government, anyway, reveals very much about how it broke codes and what it learned from breaking those codes. The oldest secrets still kept by the United States. In the United States, generally there's a 30-year rule in which things are declassified or begin to be declassified after about 30 years. But they still have secrets from World War I related to signals intelligence that they will not declassify.
Thank you so much. We would have now two questions asked in the comment section, and one is rather brief. So I will start with the brief one, and that will be a question asked by Edward Sims, and he is interested in how long did the process take for one page on the Kodak machine?
How long did that process take?
Yes.
As you can imagine, doing that with the early version of the Xerox machine took a long time. The advantage of doing it that way, though, was that it produced a large number of copies. And so short of a printing press, this was the fastest way to do this. So the multi-lith master that they would create could reproduce up to 2,000 copies of the same page. And that way you could refile those pages in multiple locations within the files, allowing for cross-referencing. And you could produce multiple copies of the entire file to distribute through your network of universities. And so despite the fact that it probably took all afternoon to do a single page, it was considered to be worthless. It was considered to be worth it by human relations area files, and in fact considered to be fast and easy compared to the alternatives. It did create all kinds of philosophical disputes, which were they computerized might be seen as software design decisions, which is to say, how frequently do you cross-reference? The initial files based around the Ditto machine could only cross-reference as many copies as they had. Well, actually, the original file in the 1930s used carbon paper. And with carbon paper and a typewriter, you could make 6 copies of a single document. So that meant that you could cross-reference it 6 times. But with a Ditto machine, you could do it 200 times. And so you could have 200 duplicates of the same thing within the files. That produced more cross-reference hits. But it also meant that your files were getting unmanageably fat. And then add the Xerox machine to that, and all of a sudden you can have 2,000 cross-references to a single code in the file. And so at that point, it becomes a managerial decision about how frequently do you do that cross-referencing.
We have a question by Marion, but first I would like to read a question by our student Noemi Weckbecker. Sorry. I will be her microphone because her microphone doesn't work, but I'm very happy to be the microphone. So thank you very much. It reads, you said during your presentation that the quest of information could lead to danger, and there was a files race. Were there any ethical indices or limitations set to this data collection, even though it was not computerized? Was there even an awareness of data protection among the public like there's today?
No, there wasn't, and that came out in the form of scandal. So when it became clear in the Thailand affair that PhD students who were doing field research in Thailand were having their ethnographic data, information that they produced in their field trips, indexed in ways that the Pentagon was using to target communities in Cambodia. And that was the point at which the Anthropological Association began to say that, you know, we really need to make some serious changes here. And in fact, they have. And if you look at ethnographic studies today, one of the things they do is they aren't clear about where the community they're studying is. So they don't, as formerly, you know, if you look at studies from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, they'll tell you exactly what the name of the village that they're doing their research in was. And now there's a clear sense that it's unethical to do that, and that one must mask the identity of one's subjects. And so it was really a beginning of a consideration about research subjects and the ways in which innocent academic research can be used for nefarious purposes.
Thank you. So far, I mean, during your introduction, you talked about kind of the past, how it all started, also this kind of interplay between government and then scientists and so on. I was more thinking about the present, and because I think that we are nowadays more talking about impersonal data, and especially that, I mean, we're not really, we still do have surveillance states and so on, but still I think that it's more a topic when it comes to private companies, and then, or like, because big data is being used to assess patterns of behavior, and then that is also again being used to place advertisements in response to this kind of behavior, and then that better resonates with customers. Many words, quick question, has it kind of gotten out of hand? Can we still regulate that or not? Thank you.
The answer is we can always regulate it. First step in that process is understanding how we got here. And it always happens that when some new fear of data emerges, there will be someone who will come along, often it's an academic historian, and point out that, oh, we've actually been doing this for a very long time. So when Edward Snowden, for instance, began to point out that the metadata scraped from mobile telephones revealed information about who was talking to who and what their addresses were, some historian pointed out that the United States government had actually been doing that since 1919. Every envelope that is mailed in the United States from 1919 on is photographed, and those photographs are kept and indexed. And that actually has to do with the terrorist act. There was an early version of a car bomb. This, of course, was before cars were used for bombs, but it was in a wagon that blew up Wall Street. And in order to track the perpetrators of this terrorist act, they tracked down their mail. And so ever since, the post office has actually been keeping metadata on everyone who uses the post. And so, you know, all of the problems that we imagine are new tend to have some antecedent. And they tend to have an antecedent that seems understandable at the time, but which we can now reconsider. We are free to re-examine that question and determine for ourselves whether it remains appropriate. This idea that the horse is always out of the barn, that because things are being done the way they are, that they have to continue being done the way they are, is just not true.
Thank you so much. I think that was the last question for today, and it was really for me very exciting to see you interacting with our students. I'm so used to the other perspective now to speak myself to the students. So it was really a pleasure to listen to this and to see this interaction, and I hope it will be continued at the DA. Really looking forward to that. Thank you so much again for being with us tonight, and thank you everybody also who joined us externally via Facebook, and of course to all the students. I think these were very great questions that triggered some very interesting and thought-provoking answers. Yeah, and with this being said, again, thank you so much. Thank you for watching on Facebook, and we hope to see you in one of our events. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Muller.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you, everybody.